So agriculture is not just about raising plants, of course, it is also about raising animals. And we call that livestock. And you see that one of the things that you see when countries industrialize is a shift towards meat. Meat is delicious. I hate to say it, don't mean to offend anybody if you're vegetarian or vegan or whatever, but we are omnivores, so it is a preference. But it is not a primary part of many developing nations' diets because it is simply expensive. Why is meat more expensive than vegetables? It's a very, or grains actually. Grains the main thing that people eat. So what is the reason for that? And it's very simple. We just have to look back to our food pyramid or our ecological pyramid. You may remember that each step in the food chain only gets 10% of what it had before it. So the simple fact of the matter is that if you're going to raise livestock, they have to be fed. That sounds obvious, but it's maybe something that you know is not that you don't take into account. And because of that, where is it? I didn't even include this in here. Shame on me. So anyway, just remember this. Livestock is going to take 10 times as much food to produce the same amount of calories as it would be if you ate the vegetable or the producer in the first place. So corn, for example, most of the corn that's grown in the United States and probably most of the industrialized world goes to feed livestock. It doesn't go to people actually eating it. So if you grow 100 calories worth of corn and eat it directly, then you'll get 10% of that will be actually added to you as a person. You'll get to use the rest of it for energy and things like that. But if you were to grow, or you wanted to get 100 calories of beef that eats that corn, of the cow that eats that corn, they're going to have to eat 1,000 calories worth of that corn. So it's 10 times the amount of agricultural impact to do that, and that's important to understand because most of your livestock is not free roaming and grazing out in the natural pastures and things like that. It is fed grain meal and things like that. And if it's not, then the pasture lands that they graze upon usually have to be watered and fertilized because it's just, you know, they're more highly concentrated than they would be naturally. And we are trying to get bigger and fatter animals than you would have natural animals, and therefore you've got to put more food into them. So that's one of the big things there. So any of the impacts you have from raising the grain, you're going to have 10 times that if you're going to eat what eats the grain. All right, and then there's certain particular things that will occur, that also occur, that are particular for livestock, one of which is soil erosion. Because of the fact that you can overgraze your cattle or sheep or anything that's a grazer, and you'll get soil erosion. Can you be a little more specific, Group 3, as to what kind of loss you face? Group 3? True.
Stuff like that.
Sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot. You know what? It's a correct answer. I'm going to give you the point for it. We're going to call it, with the technical term here, and we've used this before, is desertification. I know it's been a week, but you have to harken back to when we talked about soil conservation. We talked about the fact that desertification oftentimes happens. The cattle, etc., will eat the grass down. Now, here's the thing is about grasses is that they grow from the base. So they're adapted to being eaten, basically. And under normal conditions, kind of like you think about your yard, you mow the yard, it comes back, grows back, obviously. You wouldn't want otherwise. But if you were to go out in your yard and actually start cutting into the roots and stuff, because you keep cutting it lower and lower, like these animals will tend to start to eat further and further down, If you get past the base of that leaf and get into the roots and the things there, it will kill it. It'll kill that grass. And then the desertification process actually takes place because the grass, once it's killed and the soil is exposed, if the soil gets blown away or washed away in that instance, then it's not going to come back. You're basically going to have a desert-like. There will the soil capacity to hold water and things like that will no longer be there, and it can literally turn into a desert, go from being a natural grassland to a desert, because it takes hundreds of years for soil to regenerate itself, and so loses the water holding capacity and things like that. So be familiar with that desertification process, what it means, and those types of things. All right, another big thing is that animal waste is a major source of water pollution, very common in areas that have particularly chicken and pig farms, because they tend to keep them more concentrated and packed together because they can. That waste is highly concentrated, so you can imagine it going into the water like that, basically like them pooping into the water directly. They don't have sewage treatment facilities at these places. They have some level. Sometimes they'll have like cesspools and stuff for it to run into, but they don't process it. So not only is it organic waste, bacteria, and it's also potential for diseases as well. So that's a big impact from raising livestock. All right, any questions about livestock? The impact of eating meat? So if you are a vegetarian or vegan, my hat is off to you from your contribution, or you're better for the environment than those of us who do eat meat. So good for you. I don't think I could do it, but it'd be good for you. Alrighty, integrated pest management. Pests are not completely eliminated, but are managed. So nobody got down into here really. So what does that mean? Do you tell the pests what time they got to get up and tell them to go over there and eat this particular crop? No. What it means when you manage something, it's a little bit different definition of the term we're usually used to, but if you ever hear somebody say, I'll manage, that means they're kind of bearing something. They're saying, oh, I can handle it, I can handle a little bounce of this. That's what this means here, is you don't try to eliminate all of your pests and everything. You just realize that it's just not possible. So typically what you see, for example, with organic farms and things like that, is their output is lower. They produce less of those kind of things, but they'll counter that with the fact that they're spending less on pesticides and things like that, and also that they tend to charge more for the food they produce. Okay. So one of the strategies here, one of the main strategies here is crop rotation. Now crop rotation is good for the soil, as we mentioned before, because different crops have different effects on the soil, but also it reduces the food supply because a lot of these pests are crop specific. Potato beetles, what do you think potato beetles eat? Anybody? Potato beetles, what do you think they eat? Wrong! They eat the potato plant. Potatoes down underground, where the potatoes, they don't, yeah, so. But anyway, they eat the potato plant, and so if you switch out to something different, there's a good chance that they won't eat that new crop, and therefore they will take off. You guys need to put your phones down and pay attention, please. Alrighty, genetically engineered crops that will input pest resistance into other crops. These are GMOs, by the way, if you've seen that on packages and things like that. Some people apparently are afraid of them. That's why they'll advertise, hey, Miss Moore. Sure. What are we doing? Okay. So, anyway, plants naturally have a certain level of pest resistance to them. As a matter of fact, that's why many plants are poisonous. Is because they're trying to keep other things, insects from eating them, etc. So if you can get one that is poisonous to bugs but not going to end up being poisonous in the food product, for example, you can engineer it into the potato leaves of the potato plant, since we don't eat that, and that will, of course, reduce the need to use chemical pesticides and things like that. There are the old-fashioned physical means. That's maybe the oldest thing, where you're actually picking bugs off, or actually the main pests that agriculture deals with is not insects, it's weeds, other plants. And, plowing and tilling and hoeing in the garden and pulling weeds out, things like that's a type of physical control of pests. In this case, the pests are the weeds. Biological controls, such as predators and parasites. Predators and parasites. And there's just other organisms that control. So when you have biological controls, and this was one of the questions on your pretest. A lot of people didn't do so well on because probably the terminology was a little tough for you there. But you have a target organism, which is let's say we'll go back to our old friend, the potato beetle. So you have the potato beetle, and then you have the control organism. So let's say it's a type of wasp that eats the beetle. So that would be your control organism and your target organism. Now, one of the things that people missed on that because they didn't, and it's a tough question, granted, but there's a problem with biological control. So they're very effective, which is not the problem, of course, but there's always a potential that they will get out. So that's a bad thing because then they'll go out and they'll start affecting natural populations or whatever else, and they can reproduce, so they can multiply, and the potential is really really bad for the effects that they can have. And there's been instances where this happened. The cane toad, if anybody's familiar with that, it's actually an invasive species around the world. It started in Australia that they brought them in. They're native to some Polynesian islands. So that's good because they can't get off the island and get far, but they eat beetles, sugarcane beetles, or beetles that tend to eat sugarcane, I should say. And so they started using around the world where they grow sugarcane, but these toads have gotten out of control. They spit poison. Oh, it's nasty. We'll talk about it when we look at invasive species. But that's a control organism, the toad, that has gotten out of control and has spread a lot. The target organism, in that case, would have been the sugarcane beetles that were eating the sugarcane. So make sure you have those particular different designations. So you're using one organism to control another one when you use biological control. All right. An important point is to realize that integrated pest management does not mean no pesticides are used whatsoever. They just tend to use less, and they tend to be more targeted, and they use things like traps and other things, as opposed to broad scale like crop dusting. And crop dusting is the perfect thing to picture when you want to know the opposite of what you would do in integrated pest management. That's mass spraying. It's all over the place. It kills a lot of different things. It's not targeted, and it has major negative effects on the environment as well. All right. So, persistent pesticides. Now, persistent pesticide, from a practical level, is good. Like DDT. DDT was, and in some places still is, very commonly used. One of its positive aspects is it does stay around for a good 30 years or so. So that's good if you don't want to keep spraying pesticides, but the bad side of that, and it was determined to be too much of an impact on the environment, was the fact that it was going to stay in the environment for 30 years. So it's going to pass through the food chain. We all know what happens when pesticides pass through the food chain, or toxic things pass through the food chain. They magnify up. This is where they first discovered that process with this killing eagles and other birds of prey, eagles and ospreys in particular. So consequently, the EPA does not like that. They want things that are going to decompose quickly in the environment. So DDT, and there have been some other, they're called chlorinated hydrocarbon type pesticides, have been banned in most of your developing countries. The flip side of that is that we now use non-persistent pesticides, and guess what? They tend to be more dangerous, and that's because they've got to act quickly, basically. So you think about that, because they're going to break down the environment. And so consequently, we've had some problems with direct contact and exposure, and particularly, once again, developing nations. They always get the worst of it because they don't have the technology to keep it under control, or they tend to have more people living in rural areas or exposed areas than we do in the developed world. And there have been a lot of health problems around the world from the newer ones. There's health problems associated with the old ones too, from biomagnification and buildup in it, but not as blatant. And there's some direct contact deaths, so like industrial accidents where large amounts get spilled on somebody and it kills them, basically. These things are nothing to mess with. So, any questions? Alrighty, that is it. Speaking of which, one of the things we will